welcome to the Drum Show. In the context of Ukraine, it almost seems a bit trite to talk about media marketing. After all, many Ukrainian members of our community are currently in mortal danger, and we'll be speaking to two of them who've been affected in just a moment. Nevertheless, counterintuitive as it may seem, the communication industry is playing a key role in this crisis, and over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be discussing how big brands have found themselves in the front line of an economic war, how social media helped unite the Western Alliance, the heroic role of journalists, the power of symbolism, and how Ukraine's most effective weapon has been the amazing attitude of its people. In the studio here in London to discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Hannah Bowler and Chris Sutcliffe of The Drum, who've been writing extensively about these issues, as well as Rob Blackie, who is a digital consultant who was also a candidate for the Mayor of London on behalf of the Liberal Democrats at one point. But before speaking to our panel, let's get an insight into what life is really like on the ground. Earlier editor Cameron Clark caught up with Iryna Begma of award-winning Ukrainian agency Setapp and Marina Chernyavskaya of Bickerstaff.
Marina, Iryna, thank you so much for joining us today. And Marina, you're working from Amsterdam, I know, at the moment. How does it feel to be working when you know that's happening in the Ukraine, in your homeland?
I have a lack of focus on the work, and I have to read the news to check if my family is fine, because all of my relatives. I know that I'm lucky to be safe at the moment, but frankly speaking, I guess I would rather be with my family at the moment.
Of course. And Iryna, I know that you were in Kyiv until a few days ago, and then you had to move with your family. Can you just give us a sense of how the past few days, the last couple of weeks have been for you?
Well, frankly speaking, it was a nightmare because, the second day of the war, we had to flee from Kyiv with the children to our parents who live in the outskirts of Kyiv. Sorry, I'm just recollecting everything. I may cry, so sorry for that. We were staying there for 10 days in the basement, and then we realized that it's getting we are scared. We fly back to Kyiv with my husband and my children. And the next day, the hardest decision I've ever made was to leave my husband in Kyiv and go with two children alone to the Western Ukraine, because my child of 5 was asking, why do they want to kill us? What is the bombs or everything? And we understood that it's not something a 5-year-old should know of. And we took a evacuation bus, which took us from Kyiv to the Western Ukraine. We're in the Carpathians. At the moment, we're safe, at least. There are no sirens in here. We're not sleeping in the basement or somewhere in the toilets. Right now, it's hard to be a mom alone with 2 kids, but something I can bless for is that we're safe.
Yeah, well, we're so thankful to hear that you're both safe. Although I appreciate with family back in Ukraine or in Kyiv, in your case, Iryna, it must be incredibly difficult at the moment. Marina, I know you touched on the fact that you're working on some government work. You're using the skills and the tools that you have to contribute to the war effort.
What we are asking for from NATO and European Union to help us close the Ukrainian skies, which is to save our lives and to save lives of Ukrainians. That's probably the biggest part of our work now. We make some digital banners, print communications, some videos. Also, we are helping with brand identities and some small communications for foundations that are busy with collecting humanitarian help and stuff. We had done a video with parts of Russian soldiers that have surrendered to Ukrainian army, And we have some videos where they say that they were like lied to. They were not about to make war in Ukraine. They were not about to kill Ukrainian people. But as far as we know, in Russia, this content is totally blocked, and people just can see that.
Iryna, from your perspective, how can the sort of technology that we have available support?
We are gathering funds to prevent humanitarian crisis, and maybe this is the first thing the community can do, is to help raise funds and organize humanitarian aid for Ukrainians and people in need. We have banned our applications in Russia and Belarusian territories. So CleanMyMac, Setapp, ClearVPN, and other tools cannot be anymore uploaded in Russia or Belarus. Our MacPo engineers have created an app to see which apps have links to Russia in order to protect user data. We have also created a shortcut that helps to save battery power on iPhones, which is critical right now because many cities have been cut from the electricity. There are many applications like Apple, Amazon, companies like Adobe, Bolt, Dropbox, General Motors, Lenovo, who have seized and stopped their production or distribution in the countries. So this is something that technology can do for sure, to stop Russians using the applications of them. The best we hope for is for sure the financial support of people in need. Our company remains stable. We have stable financial operations. There's no need to support our company, but there's a severe need to support the people who are left without homes, children who are dying of dehydration, or women who are giving birth in the basements and having to flee with the children with bare feet. And this is something which we really need.
Well, Marina, Iryna, thank you for giving us your time this morning. I can't imagine the circumstances you're having to deal with right now. So we really appreciate you sharing your story with us. Please stay safe, and we hope that things are resolved for you as soon as they possibly can be. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Marina and Iryna. That is very powerful stuff indeed. And it does sort of, I suppose, really inspires you to think, well, actually, what can we do practically to help? But Rob, you have been doing some things that can make a practical difference, haven't you? Can you maybe tell us a bit more what you've been up to?
Yeah. So the basic idea of our campaign is that Vladimir Putin is terrified of the truth. Yeah, if the Russian people knew what was happening in Ukraine, they would be horrified, and that would severely weaken Vladimir Putin. It might even lead to his overthrow. So he's trying to block any news coming from Ukraine about the number of people being killed, how isolated Russia is, how hard it is. And the Ukrainians aren't welcoming the Russian army as liberators, but see them as occupiers and invaders. And so, of course, he's trying to block independent news, and he's trying to crush the tiny bits of independent news which were left in Russia at the beginning of this invasion. So our idea was, well, if people can just see the truth, they will make up their own minds, and they're very likely to be horrified by what they see. And the little trick we have is that digital advertising still happens in Russia. And the Russian government isn't very competent. So we managed to put digital advertising into Russia that allows people to access independent news about what's going on. So to do that, we have sort of a series of groups of people, one of whom are a bunch of sort of ad technology people. They work out platforms where we might be able to find a loophole. They test how we can exploit those loopholes. And once we have a loophole running well, we then put some content into it and throw some money at it to get it out to millions of people. So they get that up and running. Then we have what's basically a creative agency who create videos and images for us. So that's all the people you'd expect in a normal advertising agency, mainly in Britain, but not entirely. We've got help from Ukrainian marketers, some of whom are talking to us on Zoom, from a bunker in Kyiv, sharing their assets with us so we can use what they're doing in our work. We've got people who speak Russian. We've got people who know their way around the Russian news environment, so we can work out what's not banned. And then, of course, we have all sort of fundraising to actually pay for all of this. We've raised £35,000 so far. It's going up every day.
So
and
you're
really,
basically using programmatic tools.
we're not talking very specifically about the tools we're using, because we don't want to give away our tricks.
Yeah, but the trick is to
anything we can find
to
where we buy space
to try and get the true story into the Russian market.
That's absolutely right. And we know that even the smartest platforms in the world, like Google, struggle with moderation of ads because of the sheer number of them they have to moderate. And so typically they do it in a pretty blunt way. So my day job, I work with biotech companies. We tried an ad a few months ago about a client of mine who were developing a COVID vaccine. But I think LinkedIn's platform blocked that ad because they thought it might be misinformation. It's a stupid block, but you can see it's automated. But if you change that language, not to use the word vaccine, you can get around that block very easily. Now, the big responsible platforms employ lots of humans to review it. But in Russia, where there is much less government regulation, things are much more corrupt, it's much easier to get through those loopholes.
And I suppose what you've got to remember about Ukraine is it is one of the leading markets for developers. So it is a sort of a cyber superpower in some respects. Russia is a very strong adversary there. And I think Iryna was, alluding, to that fact as well, that they're sort of working very hard on systems to sort of get the truth out. But I should also say that video you saw earlier, there's a full 18 minutes there, so you can go online to jum.com to see it, or you can follow the links which will be surrounding this video. But the bigger picture here, though, is there is a sense that the industry really is in this economic war, and I think we've seen that a bit with how the big networks, the big agencies have been responding. Chris and Hannah, obviously, you guys have been reporting on how agencies have been specifically looking at their Ukraine markets. What's been going on there?
Well, our colleague Sam has really been across this, and he's been flagging every single time a holding company or even one of the larger agencies has announced something to do with its Ukrainian response, whether that's suspending operations there, whether that's taking care of its workers and its staff, all the way down to the people who are kind of adopting a more wait-and-see approach. Now, there are aspects of that which smack of reputational damage. If your holding company isn't seen to be doing anything around Ukraine at the moment, then that potentially risks kind of polluting your reputation and the work you do on behalf of brands. But it is such a fast-moving situation that I think Sam is probably stretched to his maximum to actually cover all this.
Yeah. It's horrible because none of them are geared up for it. I was speaking to a leading HR manager for one of the world's biggest tech companies who was saying she has 200 people in Ukraine. And she's getting all sorts of calls from them seeking really practical help, like can we get a taxi out of Kyiv, for example. It's really a difficult situation for companies because there's no, I think, playbook that allows them to cope with this.
We talk about the marketing industry, but we have to remember that we do work on behalf of brands, and there are so many brands. You mentioned the fact that Ukrainian is almost a cyber superpower. So we do have so many colleagues. Brands have people on the ground in Ukraine, even if they aren't tangentially related to kind of the marketing industry. So it doesn't just affect the marketing industry, but it affects the brands on whose behalf we work.
Yeah, and of course the other side of the coin is what's been going on in Russia itself, because I think Russia has now been subject to the biggest ever rapid deglobalization in history. And again, the big agencies have been at the forefront of that.
They've all majorly pulled out. I mean, there's WPP, Accenture. I think what's hard as well is there's just a huge question around staff, because the people on the ground in Russia, whether they agree, like if they're pro or against, like this is people's jobs that are just kind of wiped overnight. And it's been very hard to understand if like the financial support they'll get, redundancy packages, there's so many questions that this opens about, innocent Russians that are caught up in this, the collateral damage, I guess, for the ad agencies. That I think a lot of clarity is kind of needed around that.
Absolutely, and even internally as well, which I suppose is what you're doing, actually trying to disseminate this information to Russians who might not otherwise know exactly what's going on, why these sanctions have been imposed. So, it's important to note that, we are not on the ground there, we don't have an idea of what it is like to try and communicate and even consume media in Russia. But from what you've seen, does that mean that there are people who are starved of accurate information in Russia at the moment?
Oh, absolutely, and that's why we can see the way people react to ads. We get incredibly high click-through rates on them, for instance, because people are desperate for that information. If you've got a kid aged 18, 19, 20, there's a good chance they're a conscript in the army. They've probably had their phone confiscated, and you want to know where they are and if they're safe. And so you're desperate for that information, and that's millions and millions of people in Russia in that situation alone.
But the actual other practical, just bringing it back to our industry, is I think individuals losing their jobs. I mean, even the drum's been affected this. We had some developers in Belarus, unfortunately, had to let these guys go. But you couldn't actually tell them, or they were reluctant to ask why, what they'd done wrong, because you're worried about their secure communications. You obviously can't criticise the government. And you do feel for people in Russia. I mean, it's difficult in the context of what happened in Ukraine, but when you actually know some of the people who have been affected by this in Russia, it is a tragedy for Russians. And I think one of the things, people have been trying to get across is important to separate the Russian government from the Russian people, isn't it?
100%. And actually, we were talking before the recording about, brands have obviously had an exit strategy for this, but in terms of kind of a re-entrance to that market once things have potentially settled down, do we re-establish communications with staff ahead of time? What do we do to ensure that kind of the people on who we worked with aren't going to be disproportionately affected, and how we can support them? It's moving so fast that I don't think anybody has a concrete answer yet.
Yeah, but the other really fast thing, isn't it, is the amount of actual consumer brands or companies pulling out. I think, well, the last time I looked, the Telegraph had a great list of 124, but I think it's now even more. What do you make of that?
Well, again, that's a huge amount of staff. I mean, I think the stat on IKEA was 14,000, which again, that's just mass unemployment scale, because you think of all of these brands are huge players in Russia. So there's a staffing crisis again, but also again, I guess, but it's hard because I feel like a brand now can't operate in Russia. It's PR disaster. It's just, it can't go on really.
No. Yeah.
But then there's also been brands that have come out late. So there's just so much pressure on them that you can't really be a Western brand and still be there.
And I suppose what the shock is the suddenness of it. Because I'm old enough to remember Perestroika and Gorbachev, and when McDonald's opened in Moscow, that did officially seem to me to mark the end of the Cold War. Yeah. And while sort of looking at this, I was reminded of a commercial that I think appeared in the late 80s or 90s of Pizza Hut, which I think sums this whole thing up.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев?
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Well, it's obviously quite humorous, but my goodness, it does sum up a lot of these issues.
It's a world apart from now. Like Hannah mentioned, the fact that we're seeing brands, not just kind of the consumer-facing ones, but even entertainment properties are just pulling out in such rapid succession. You mentioned kind of those 124 brands mentioned in the Telegraph. Just this morning, we've seen brands including Activision, PlayStation, announce that they are pulling spend. This is an economic and entertainment sanction in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and there's an old sort of saying that no two countries with McDonald's have ever declared war on each other, which I think was true, but obviously the rate of these brands leaving does sort of sum up that there's a new reality here, and it's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, I was saying it's like Russia's being cancelled in a way, and that's like the new version of war.
Well, yeah, we can talk about that in a little bit, but the kind of that memification of this, the fact that brands are so keenly aware of what this actually looks like to their consumers, they need to be seen to be doing something. So they don't just need to be seen to be pulling out, but they need to be doing it for a political and kind of an ethical reason as well. And so we are seeing the communications industry really go into overdrive to communicate the fact that they are no longer trading with a country that is seen to be doing something completely
And there is actually a danger to that, as it can actually cut off Russians more from the outside world and from communication of what's going on. And actually, if McDonald's closes, that's not going to change communications between Russians and the outside world. But actually, if you shut down a computer game and people have been chatting in the chat about what's happening in Ukraine. You have shut down a communication channel between countries.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because obviously the channels you do not want to shut down are social media.
Yeah.
But social media has obviously been really impacted by this. And again, I think the Drum's been reporting a lot about the changes they're making and the changes they've been forced to make.
Well, we have, absolutely, and it's interesting because it goes back to kind of the January 6th riots, which put in place a lot of the kind of the groundwork for social media response to misinformation of this scale and also kind of fast-moving events. So in the immediate aftermath, we saw Twitter and YouTube double down on their labeling of state-sponsored Russian media. Since then, we've seen other platforms adopt that, and we've seen kind of social media platforms, including Meta, really stamp down on the amount of disinformation that they are allowed. Now, as I'm sure you'll know, there is an awful lot of grey area there. There's an awful lot of loopholes. So even though Meta has shut down any ad spend from kind of Russian state media, Chinese media has been buying pro-Russian ads. And there are a bunch of different Russian language sites, which are effectively aggregators for Russian media, which are still slipping through the net. They are still being allowed to purchase ads and sell and disseminate information across these platforms. So it is an incredibly complex ecosystem. And inevitably that means that there are going to be people who are not to belittle the point, but getting away with this.
Yeah, but also I suppose the other point is that it does underline how social media can be a force for good. Because there's no doubt that this is, well, maybe not the first social media war, but it's probably the war where social media has had the biggest effect. Because if you look at how President Zelensky's used it, there's no doubt. I think that the Drum is reporting as well. There's no doubt that his use of social media has actually changed the whole nature of this conflict in terms of helping unite the West.
I do think there's been a bit of a blind spot from the social media companies. For the last few years, particularly since Trump got elected, they've been focused on misinformation in Western countries from people like the Russians. And the truth is, that's not really a problem today. Ukraine has won the information war in the West. Almost every Western country overwhelmingly supports it. What they're much weaker on is what they can do positively to get the truth through in Russia. And that's the big hole at the moment. And of course, when Facebook shuts down advertising in Russia, that's complying with Russian law, with Putin's law, and in many ways actually helping him, because it makes it harder for messages from the outside world to get through. Now, of course, the day they break that law, they all get shut down in Russia, but it's actually their choice to do that. And I think maybe actually they should stand up for themselves, do that for one day, get banned, and actually when they disappear, that will be a very visible thing to a bunch of people in Russia. Yeah. And every time Putin has to close down a platform, it makes him look scared. And I think that's what we need him to look like.
So I need to make some brave decisions here, perhaps.
Yeah.
And,
it's very easy for them not to make money out of Russia. It probably wasn't a major market for them in the first place.
Yeah. President Zelensky, I think, has used social media exceptionally well. He's used it in terms of proving that he's not scared of the Russians. He's going to stay in his capital. He's still alive. He's used it to build morale. Chris, what do you think?
Well, it's been an effective counter to Russian disinformation. We've seen a bunch of different state-sponsored outlets say, actually, Kyiv has fallen, Zelensky has fled, and he has been very, very keen to show across all the social platforms, no, he's still there, he is still talking to people, and he is still very much present in the capital. So he has effectively taken what was a kind of underhand, slightly under the surface disinformation strategy from Russia, and he's really brought it to the light. As you mentioned, the West is so much, well, in fact, kind of the vast majority of the world is so much on the side of the Ukrainians, in part because they have allowed the messaging to flourish on social media, which they know is so international, so global, that they can get messages out there in a way that actually speaks to people in a way that this kind of slightly, the subterfuge of kind of the previous disinformation strategy of Russia doesn't allow for.
Ukraine is now. And now is special. It's a turning point. There can be another now. You can hear it. You can see it. You can feel it. Now, and now.
The other thing which has been really fascinating over the last 2 weeks is just how this whole issue has transformed perceptions, isn't it? I mean, positions that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago are now becoming more acceptable. For instance, the fact that oil and gas is now seen as, viable, or we're going to open up our oil fields and gas fields again. It's transformed the reputation of Poland and Hungary, who were criticised for not supporting refugees. Now they're being, very open, but it's also sort of, changed perceptions. I mean, domestically in the UK, Boris Johnson is suddenly not looking as vulnerable, and even the BBC, who was, a bit of a,
under the chopping block from Nadine.
Absolutely, yes, Nadine hated that fact, because in one moment she wanted to sort of remove the licensing fee. There were definitely a whipping point. Now suddenly she's almost moved to tears when describing the heroics of the journalists. And I think we've got a clip of that.
And at this point, I'd just like to offer my heartfelt thanks and admiration to all of those journalists working for the BBC, the ITV and other news outlets who are risking their lives to bring us unbiased and accurate news from a live war zone. Mr. Speaker, we will keep ratcheting up the pressure on Putin, and I will use all the levers in my department to ensure that he is fully ostracised from the international community.
Well, that's amazing to see Nadine Norris get so emotional about, the BBC, one of their arch critics. But it's fair to say, I think that, we've talked about, reputations that have been redeemed, but I think the sort of the honourable profession of journalism is one of those professions. The whole issue has really sort of reminded us why it's so important to get that sort of independent reporting, isn't it?
It's taken for granted until it's needed.
Yeah, and it's been amazing to see the broadcasters double down on increasing their news coverage, taking the ads out, putting extra hours on or extra time onto the news reportings. Ratings have been through the roof. I mean, I've followed some of the ratings and people are just watching it and tuning in and seeing the live news, which is something that has not happened in a very long time.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see the broadcasters kind of react, change their schedules, really fund the journalists and bring that to the UK.
And they've also put themselves in real jeopardy this time. I mean, there's that famous footage of Sky News where that does sum up that they are risking their lives to bring us this information. So it really is so they really are heroes. I don't think that's over the top to say that.
The debris of this war litters every street. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Oh! That's a tyre, isn't it?
Oh, that's a bullet.
That was a bullet.
Right?
No, it wasn't a bullet.
It wasn't. Something blew up under us.
Something went bang. Oh, there's a big hole.
Okay. Oh,
Whoa!
okay.
Wait.
Whoa! Whoa! What? Whoa! Whoa! Whoa!
But really dramatic stuff. I think that was shot outside Kyiv. They got caught by some Russian saboteurs. Two of them actually got hit, but luckily I think they were saved by their flak jackets. So it does sort of demonstrate just, the risks they are taking.
And that's the sort of stuff that Putin doesn't want seen. And that's the incredible thing has been the last week, the speed at which they've been destroying what's left of independent media in Russia. They shut down radio stations, they shut down newspapers, they passed a law saying you can go to jail for 15 years for basically saying the word war. BBC had a brilliant first week reporting into Russia, and then that got banned. So now you can only get to it in Russia if you can find a way around the rules, and gradually they're cutting that off.
And the BBC have now relaunched a shortwave radio service, which just sums up. But the interesting thing about even shortwave radio, these traditional skills are coming back to the fore. And one of the great skills is the power of photography. I don't know if there's actually a picture now dominated the front pages today there was a bombing in the town of Mariupol yesterday where they hit a maternity hospital. And this photographer's got this really, really powerful images of a woman who's obviously either in labour or very close to being in labour, having to be stretchered away. And I think it's one of those pictures that's going to become one of the defining images, I think, in the Telegraph, in the Guardian, and it just, the old cliche of a picture tell, a good picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that's worth more than 1,000 words. And again, I think if Russians, the Russian people could see what Mother Russia is doing to mothers, they would probably...
And that's the volume of footage that's also coming out from the Ukrainians on social media. I'm sure that some of that will be getting through. It'll be getting through on Telegram. It'll be getting through in all sorts of ways. And that footage is very compelling, and it's very obviously real. And it must actually be, that's a very hard thing for Russia to control, because there are so many different bits of it. So you can't just search for one photo you're trying to ban. It's thousands and thousands of things.
Yeah, but it's interesting how the tools of the media, images and communications are having such a big impact. Another big impact, I think, is just symbolism. That for example, the Ukrainian flag itself, who would have been able to describe that just a couple of weeks ago?
I know we know kind of the symbolism behind it as well, kind of the golden fields of wheat under the blue sky as well. So it's really become a symbol not just of the country itself, but of kind of the underlying message of resistance and freedom.
The other side of that spectrum is obviously the Z symbol, which I think they sprayed Z on tanks or armaments to define which military district it came from. But this Z has become almost part World War Z, really, hasn't it? Where it's been adopted by the pro-Russians.
We've seen it all over the place. There's merch being sold within Russia. I think there was also some that was being sold outside until it was stamped down on. But it's been adopted as this kind of symbol of pro-Russian conduct in a way that we would never have expected. The memification of the war has continued so fast now that we're seeing Russian athletes wear kind of a Z symbol on the podium next to Ukrainian athletes. And we've seen people selling sweatshirts and merchandise of this symbol. Even 2 weeks ago, it was meaningless, effectively. There's context now given to this kind of one, it's a single letter, and yet it now stands for so much. It really does speak to that kind of that idea that you can market almost anything and you can make it mean what you want.
Yeah, so it does have the power of image, the power of graphics, really. The swastika as well. And I don't know about you, but the Z does remind me a bit of that swastika. It's that.
Again, we're talking about kind of the dissemination of information. I've seen it adopted and kind of changed in Photoshop to actually resemble a swastika. So yeah, absolutely. I think by design, people are trying to make that associated in people's minds.
Yeah, it just shows you that actually, if you can use, if graphic design can be that powerful when it's misused, just how powerful it can be when it's used properly, like in terms of the Ukrainian flag. Well, and unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel, Rob, Chris and Hannah. Thank you very much for taking part. Just a reminder, the video we saw earlier of Marina and Iryna, you can see at thedrum.com in full. But what I want to do is leave you now with a little bit of footage again from I think we've got Reddit and YouTube to thank for this. It's from Odessa, who are obviously getting ready for a really serious siege, and I think this little video really sums up the spirit of the Ukrainian people, because what it shows is this military band standing in front of a barricade playing "Don't Worry, Be Happy." It's an amazing video, so we'll have a look at that, and remember at the very end we're going to show you a link as well, which you can click on so you can maybe donate to the Ukrainian cause. Thanks for watching.